Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Joe Caramelli, and I oversee Grand Rounds for the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. And thank you for joining today's Grand Rounds presentation. Now, for this academic year, we're trying out a theme for most presentations called Next Steps in Care, which is a series of presentations on innovations and updates in clinical care. Most presentations are trying to be consistent with that theme. Now, there's a group of us who work on Grand Rounds each week, including Semhar Abraha as the coordinator and on communications, and Mike Walker on technology. We do archive our presentations at the Grand Rounds website, where you could look at past Grand Rounds from this academic year and from prior years. Two sources of funding for the Grand Rounds series. One is through the Ripley Fund and the other through institutes in the department, such as the Garvey Institute for Brain Health Solutions. Partway through the presentation, close to the end, I'll put a link for a Grand Round speaker evaluation in the chat. Please complete that evaluation. It's just 5 questions. It's helpful for me and others on the team to review evaluations to plan out the Grand Round series. You can also submit questions throughout the presentation in the chat box. I'll collect all the questions and comments and can go through those at the end with today's presenters. And you're always welcome to write directly to me as well with any comments about the Grand Round series. So for today, we have a different topic and a different objective with Grand Rounds. The topic is reporting about mental health in the Seattle Times. And the objective is to learn about investigation, story selection, reporting, reach of this reporting by 2 people who do the work. Hannah Fafaro, who's a mental health reporter with the Seattle Times, and Diana Samuels, the editor of this series at the Seattle Times. Now, this is an example of, I think, of trying out something new in Grand Rounds. And if you have an idea for a new topic, a new objective within the Grand Round series, I'm open to hearing about that. So importantly, today's topic it is not just about how we can learn updates about the clinical work, the research work, and training that occurs in Washington State, but it's also a lot of us can learn about how, more broadly, about how policy decisions affect individuals across the state, how things about policy are reported, community decisions and efforts, the personal experiences of individuals experiencing mental illnesses and the family members of these individuals. What are barriers to seeking treatment? What are some outcomes of these illnesses? And how this news and information affects not only our daily work, but really people across Washington State. So I'll stop there for now, and I'll turn it over to Diana Samuels, who will start off today's Grand Rounds.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to share my screen. One sec. So today we wanted to introduce you to the Mental Health Project at the Seattle Times, which is a fairly new initiative for our newspaper, and share some information about how we report out our stories. Just to give you a quick idea of the agenda for our presentation today, wanted to introduce you to the project, talk a bit about how we engage with our readers, give some examples of the stories and projects that we've done so far and have been covering. And then we wanted to talk about research stories in particular, since I think a lot of you might be interested in that. And then we will have some time at the end for any questions. So let's start with the basics. What is Mental Health Project? The Mental Health Project is a team of 4 journalists at the Seattle Times who focus specifically on covering mental and behavioral health in Washington State. To our knowledge, this is the first of its kind project done by a regional newspaper in the country. Through our work, we hope to educate our readers about mental health conditions, spotlight promising treatments and research, and examine actions by government agencies, healthcare providers, and other stakeholders who work in the field seeking to address mental health concerns. So the project came about through a somewhat lucky set of circumstances. The Seattle Times has had a long history of creating grant-funded projects that allow us to deepen our reporting. As I'm sure you're aware, local news in general has been facing a crisis for many years now. Revenues have been falling, forcing massive cuts in newspaper and news organization staff. Nationally, between 2004 and 2020, there was a 57% drop in newsroom employees at local outlets. So that means that many local newspapers around the country are stretched incredibly thin and just don't have time to do this kind of work. While there's still great journalism being done, their coverage has definitely suffered as a result. So to help preserve journalism in our own community in Seattle, the Seattle Times has tried a lot of different innovative approaches and models. And one of these is about turning to the community for funding to cover specialized topics. For example, for several years now, we've had our Education Lab and Project Homeless teams, which are funded by major donors like the Gates Foundation and Starbucks. So those organizations fund the project, the coverage runs in the Seattle Times. We are independent from our funders. We don't, they don't have any say in what we cover or how we cover it, but we certainly, of course, appreciate the support. So most recently, we launched the Investigative Journalism Fund, which is funded by smaller donors. Anyone can go to the website and offer a donation, and that team has now reached 10 people. So we have a very large investigative team for a regional newspaper. So overall, this funding approach has been a really effective and successful model for us, and we've actually seen it being adopted by other newspapers around the country too. In the meantime, mental health coverage had been something that our leadership had wanted to do more with for a long time, and especially during the pandemic. It had, as a topic, it has a lot of connection with our other grant-funded projects like Education Lab and Project Homeless, and so it just seemed like something that was a ripe topic to explore. And then last year, the Ballmer Group reached out and fortuitously wanted to fund a project specifically on this topic. So our leadership jumped at the opportunity. The stars kind of aligned. And so Ballmer has provided us with funding to run the project for 2 years. And we very much hope it continues beyond that mark. So after the leadership of our paper received the funding and drafted up the basics of the project, reached an agreement with Ballmer Group, they put together the team. Most of us have actually been at the Seattle Times in other capacities. So a lot of the hires were internal. I'm the team's editor. I came to the Seattle Times in 2019. And for just over 2 years, I was the newspaper's law and justice editor. So I covered crime, police accountability, policing. Before that, I worked at the Times-Picayune in New Orleans for about 6 years, and I was a reporter and an editor there. And I covered a lot of breaking news, crime, local government, just kind of anything going on in the community. Hannah Fafara, who's here with me today, came to this project after 2 years on our Education Lab team. She has a master's in science and health journalism from Columbia University, and previously wrote about neuroscience and psychiatry before she came to Seattle. Her work focused on psychiatric drugs, new treatments, and rare mental health conditions, and she's published stories in publications like Science, the Wall Street Journal, and the Atlantic. Hannah's scientific expertise has definitely been a huge asset to the team, and I think you can see that in the stories that she's written. Our other reporter is Esme Jimenez, who came to the Seattle Times from KUOW, where she was covering immigration and some other topics. Before joining that NPR affiliate, she worked at Northwest Public Broadcasting in Yakima, and also right before coming to the Times, completed a big investigation examining ICE's practice of incarcerating immigrant youth. She's also been a fellow with the ProPublica Data Institute, the Maynard Institute, and NPR. Michelle Bruckman is our engagement editor, and I'll talk more about what that means, what engagement is later. But Michelle's work focuses on direct interaction with readers, both in person, online, and print. Michelle was previously the engagement editor for our traffic lab team, which covers transportation in Seattle and King County. And there she fostered conversations with readers and community groups. She helped host public events and wrote explanatory articles. So that's our team. I think it's a pretty cool mix of skill sets and backgrounds, and it's worked out really well for us. We all know that the need in Washington for mental health care is immense, but just wanted to highlight some statistics that show kind of the scale of the problem. In Washington, more than 1 in 5 adults has a diagnosable mental illness. And our state ranks 6th for the highest percentage of adults with a mental, behavioral, or emotional disorder. Yet only 12% of our residents live where their mental health needs can be met. This was all exacerbated during the pandemic. 40% of adults have experienced a mental or behavioral health condition during the pandemic. And a third of people who are 50 or older reported going a month or more without interacting with others. So with that immense need in mind, we've developed a mission that kind of hits on 5 key points. This is evolving. It'll continue to be informed by what we learn from our sources and our readers. But number 1, we want to examine our state's mental and behavioral health care systems and hold them accountable while searching for better solutions. Number 2, we want to help destigmatize mental illness and behavioral health challenges. Number 3, we want to untangle the complexities around barriers to accessing care, especially for people of color, LGBTQ people, and those with lower incomes. 4th, we want to share experiences to help readers really understand mental health and illness at a human level. And finally, we want to provide help. We want to provide connections and resources to help readers seek care and improve their mental health. So I wanted to talk a bit in particular about engagement, which is a huge part of our work. Engagement can take many forms, but at its heart, it means connecting with readers on a deeper level than just writing a story, putting it out there, people read it in the paper. One core piece of our approach is hosting events, and this is a flyer from an event we hosted a little while back in partnership with the local League of Women Voters. For that event, we brought together different experts from King County to talk about the behavioral health system here. And it turned out great. It was a popular event. We had several hundred people come. We also had an event more recently where we brought in a couple of therapists who give really practical advice for what to do when you're seeking therapy, what to expect, how to reach out to therapy offices. And so that was a really nice kind of tangible, practical set of advice that they were able to give our audience. We've also started a series of contributed columns that we call mental health perspectives, where contributors, primarily people who have personal experiences with mental and behavioral health issues, we work with them to write a column and so they can share their own stories. This has been a really great opportunity for us to elevate the voices of people with lived experience in mental health. And our readers have really appreciated hearing directly from these community members. Another big part of our engagement work is, as I mentioned in our mission, we want to provide tangible help for people. So we've been doing a lot of resource guides to help give real world advice, to help them navigate the system, to know what to expect, that kind of thing. For example, recently we did a pair of guides. They were kind of dual-sided. One was aimed at kids, one was aimed at adults. And it gave tips from experts for how to talk to each other about mental health. For example, if a parent is worried that their child is experiencing suicidal ideation, how do you get that conversation started? So that is an overview of our engagement approach. But I wanted to talk a bit about a couple of specific larger stories that we worked on. We launched the Mental Health Project on September 19th. And for the launch, we wanted to focus on the COVID-19 pandemic and the impacts on our community. It just felt like it's been such a difficult time for so many people, as you all know. And it's also been a time when we've, I think, learned to speak more openly about mental health. And so it just felt appropriate to launch with a story that tapped into the effects of the pandemic and what it's meant for the community. So one of our reporters looked at the pain of loneliness for older adults in particular. They're already at risk of isolation, and the pandemic has been absolutely devastating for them. It was paired with a infographic package that gave an overview of basic facts and definitions about mental and behavioral health care in Washington State. Hannah put that one together, and it just shared a lot of really important and interesting statistics that show how great the need is. We had a really strong response to the debut of the project, and have continued to hear from readers since, who are just really appreciative that the Seattle Times is investing in this topic. And so that's been really rewarding to hear. In December, we did another big project that looked at the issue of access to mental health care. As we've been talking to people in the field, our readers, we just kept hearing over and over again, it's just hard to find care, whether it's an inpatient bed, whether it's a therapy appointment. And that's, of course, just gotten worse during the pandemic. So we started with kind of a straightforward question about, why is it so hard to find a therapist? The answer is a bit more complicated than that question might indicate, but we learned that a combination of insurance barriers and workforce pipeline problems make it hard for everyone to access care, and it's especially hard for people with lower incomes, people of color, LGBTQ people, and others whose needs for a provider might be a little bit more specific. So we paired that story. This was a week-long series, so we had several pieces to it, but we paired that particular story with a set of written submissions from people in the community who talked about their own experiences struggling to find care. So they're just personal stories that we worked with them to write. And they were very powerful, and again, highlighted a key part of our engagement strategy, which is centering the voices of people with lived experience. Other parts of the week-long series included a story that looked at the history of mental health care in Washington State, history of policymaking, institutions. It's a fascinating history, and it starts before Washington even was a state. And it continues to have impacts today on how we approach mental illness and mental health. As part of the series, we also had a graphical representation about the different systems of outpatient and inpatient care. So you could kind of walk through the different steps. And it had some interactive features online. It was a big full page graphic and print. And then we had a couple of resource guides as well. One looked at just tips for finding a therapist if you're having trouble breaking through the wait list. And then another talked about what to do in the meantime if you're having trouble finding a therapist, some wellness advice, that kind of thing. So these are examples of a couple of our largest projects, but of course we've also been doing periodic stories in between these bigger series, and they can range from just covering a news event, like we did a couple of pieces about the legislature and what sorts of mental health bills that they were considering. Other times it might be something like a Q&A with an expert on a particular topic. We definitely want to give our readers a good sense of variety in the types of coverage: shorter stories, longer stories, lighter stories when we can. And that's been our approach. Now I'm going to turn it over to Hannah, who will tell you a bit about how she's approached covering scientific research, and also how she went about reporting out an investigative story that we published recently.
Thanks, Diana. As you can tell, our team has a pretty broad mandate. Part of our initial goal has been to balance stories about public policies with journalism that focuses on science and treatment advancements. As someone who spent several years writing about neurodevelopmental and psychiatric conditions, covering research is very important to me. We've thankfully already found lots of exciting ways to write about science at UW and other local research institutions. I wanted to start off by talking about two stories that feature some of your UW colleagues. The first is about research led by Dr. Marco Pravatoni, who, as you all probably know, is heading up a new lab dedicated to developing therapeutics against addictive substances. This story was a really interesting one for me as a reporter because I had an opportunity to learn about a field of research that was not familiar to me. This story also had a solutions angle, which means that it examined the pitfalls, but also the promises of Dr. Pravatoni's work, which at least in this story, what we examined here was the promise of a vaccine against addiction. That's something that he's been working on for a very long time. I'm drawn to stories like this one because it shows how researchers are continuing to push the limits of what we know might work for especially intractable conditions like substance use disorders. And as a science journalist, I'm always thinking about how we can balance in our stories sort of the promise of these types of solutions with the reality that science is a very slow and iterative process. And so I thought the experiences that Dr. Pravatoni and his colleagues shared with me really got at that tension. So this one was a fascinating one for me to work on. The second story that I'll talk about is focused on electroconvulsive therapy. This one came out a couple of weeks ago, and it takes a look at an emerging body of research that suggests that ECT was essential, not elective, for some patients during the pandemic. Some of you may know this, but in many hospitals in the US and also abroad, ECT suddenly was classified as an elective treatment, especially when COVID cases were peaking at various points in the pandemic. ECT is an incredibly difficult treatment to write about for many reasons, but I was drawn to the story because to me, it seemed like an example of a really unfortunate pandemic era experiment that essentially tested what happens when people are forced to forego ECT for weeks or even months at a time in some cases. Through my reporting, I found at first anecdotal reports and then eventually bigger studies that had pretty dire results. So some of the research that I was looking at found that when hospitals decided to cancel or postpone ECT treatments, many patients relapsed into depression and to symptoms of other conditions that they had. And in several cases, psychiatrists reported patients who died by suicide. These findings were really compelling, and they also fit with what I was hearing from local psychiatrists here in Washington. So I ended up spending quite a bit of time reporting this story with psychiatrists and also people who undergo ECT, and I was really grateful that they were willing to open up about their experiences. Here you'll see Dr. Anna Borisovskaya, who I spent quite a bit of time with. She and others were really candid about their experiences having to ration ECT and how difficult that was for them personally and professionally. There really were consequences for a lot of folks, including the psychiatrist. Dr. Borisovskaya ended up leaving her position, because of having to ration care. She still practices ECT, but people had to make really tough decisions because of the circumstances that they were in. So in any case, I'm hopeful that this story and the experiences that these folks shared with me will help destigmatize this treatment. I did receive a lot of feedback after it published from folks who've undergone ECT, saying that they felt very seen and just, in that story, and that they hadn't really seen a story like ECT told in that way. So I think that really highlights, the power of our storytelling now at the times, what we can do locally to help sort of destigmatize some of these treatments. All right, Diana, I'm ready for the next slide. Thanks. So after hearing about these stories, you might be wondering what goes into deciding when or if we choose to write a story about science or advancements in treatment. So for me, it starts with having a good sense of the scientific literature and what new studies are coming out and when they're coming out. I try to stay on top of new research by subscribing to journals. Because I work in media, I have the benefit of oftentimes getting embargoed copies of research or getting copies of the table of contents early on, which gives me a head start in thinking about stories that I want to write. I also rely on trust and relationships that I've built with PIs. So this relationship building is important for me personally because I like to hear about research as soon as possible. It's hard for me to write a science story the day it publishes for a lot of reasons. One is that science is really complicated and I don't feel like I can always do the best job if I'm writing a day of story. So this is all to say that usually I like to hear about research early on and then spend days or even weeks talking with folks, getting a better understanding of what motivated the research question and how those findings fit with what we already know in the literature. So after, I kind of decided I have a study or a set of studies that I want to write about, I'll check in with 2 or 3 outside researchers about the work, make sure that the research is solid, and eventually maybe I'll interview those folks more formally to round out the story. One thing that I would say, some of you folks might be wondering about this is that you hear me talking. I do talk to folks before the research publishes with the understanding that we won't publish until an embargo lifts. So that gives, I think, researchers and institutions the safety to know, you can come to the Seattle Times and talk to me and we 100% respect embargoes. We really wouldn't be able to do the work we do if we didn't. So that provides, some security for you as you think about whether to pitch to us. Another thing that I'll say is that readers certainly seem to connect more with science stories that have real world implications on their own daily lives. So when I approach a research story, I'm often looking for practical ways that the work might advance access to treatment or healthcare in some way. I mention that because, as you probably can tell from the stories that I just told you about, the personal aspect of these stories is really important. It helps our readers connect to science. And so as you're thinking through, research that you might have to pitch to us, let us know if there's some sort of personal angle or something else that you think will help humanize the research that you're working on. All right, I'm ready for the next slide. So now I want to turn and talk about something a little bit different. I wanted to tell you about a series of stories that our team recently published that illustrate some of the ways that our team can hold certainly policymakers accountable with our reporting, but also other powerful institutions. So I have a personal interest in pediatrics. I've written about kids in a variety of ways throughout my career as an education reporter and also as a health and science reporter. I think, people knew that about me. And so over, most of 2021, I had a lot of folks just reaching out to me individually without prompting, healthcare workers, psychiatrists, who wanted to share with me a warning about a growing crisis that they were seeing in their hospitals and particularly in their emergency departments. So I was listening to their stories, and what they were telling me is that each night, dozens of kids were showing up to the ERs in psychiatric crisis with suicidal behaviors or plans or experiencing psychosis. And certainly this is something that had happened before, but the sheer number of kids and also their acuity was really concerning to folks. And so the ERs essentially were becoming stretched far beyond their limits to care for these kids. As the months wore on, I heard that this crisis was escalating to the point that ERs could no longer find inpatient placements. And they felt that really their only choice was to house or board kids in ERs as they were waiting for a bed. We've heard about this boarding, in ERs before. Certainly the state has addressed this issue in some ways, or at least, acknowledge the crisis when it comes to adults, but the scope and scale of this problem with children really had not been addressed publicly to date. And so we felt it was really important to take a look at this issue. And the result was a series called Housed in the Hospital, and this published in February. And we investigated why hundreds of Washington children are spending weeks or even months stuck in windowless ER rooms. We found that this was the case across all 3 of the state's pediatric ERs. And of course, when kids are in ERs, they are not getting access to the type of standard psychiatric care that they need. We thought the story was important enough to spend quite a bit of time on because we thought it was a really stark example of how the state's mental health system is failing kids and also teenagers. So the first story is focused on a 16-year-old named Dylan Thompson. I'm ready for the next slide. So Dylan Thompson grew up just outside of Kashmir, Washington. He has been diagnosed with autism, ADHD, depression, psychosis, and he also has low intellectual ability. He has auditory and visual hallucinations, and at times he's been prone to both suicidal and homicidal behaviors. Like many kids with mental health conditions, he was diagnosed many years after he started experiencing symptoms. Similar to many families who I spoke with, about their own children, Dylan had been in and out of ERs and inpatient care before getting stuck for an extended period in the ER in 2021. He spent just over a month inside Sacred Heart Children's Emergency Department in Spokane. So, in hearing Dylan's story and from what I'd heard from others, I spent several months reporting and eventually found out that about 30 kids are having the same experience as Dylan in Washington every single night. One estimate from the state of Washington says that we spend about $20 million boarding kids in ERs every year, although a lot of experts I talk to think that's a wild underestimate because it doesn't really account for the lost cost to hospitals that can't see more kids in the bed where a child is boarding. So in any case, there's a lot of money that's being lost because of this, because of the lack of access to proper care. One other thing, that I learned in the story that was kind of interesting and concerning to folks is that there are only 94 psychiatric inpatient beds to serve more than 1.1 million Washington children. And I also learned recently that because of pandemic-related staffing shortages, there are actually far fewer than 94 beds online at any given time because these inpatient units have had to cut back their census as they've lost staff and not been able to replace them. So I'm ready for the next slide. I think I mentioned this, but Dylan's story, unfortunately, was very similar to many that I heard before. And since the story's published, I've also heard many more similar stories to what he experienced. These stories, I think, illustrate what I call the loop, which starts with the diagnostic odyssey that kids often go through. It eventually evolves into attempts and failures to get proper outpatient care. And then, in some cases, symptoms escalate to the point where Dylan's did, where he needed immediate crisis intervention. I think, many families end up being really surprised when they bring their child to the ER and they learn that it is not a direct route to inpatient psychiatric care. As Dylan's story illustrates, it can take months before landing a placement. To my knowledge, it's been at least, I think it's 6 months now since Dylan entered Sacred Heart in Spokane. And the last I heard, he was still waiting now in an acute care unit as the state and his family try to find him a long-term placement where he can actually get proper psychiatric care. So I'm ready for the next slide. So this was the first, one I just told you about was the first in a series. We've since published another story, and I think that we'll publish probably more. This is the second story in this Housed in the Hospital series. This one examined a slightly different type of, it's still boarding, but it's a little bit more complicated. Kids, over the course of my reporting, I learned that sometimes children end up boarding in ERs because their families can't or won't pick them up. So let me explain why this is happening. A family might bring their child to the ER and their child might be in the midst of a mental health crisis. But when their child stabilizes, the family might decide, they're not ready for their child to discharge and that they can't bring them home. This is pretty rare and also a pretty fraught circumstance. I found out that usually when this is happening, it's because the family doesn't have the financial resources to care for their child's intense needs. They might have other children to care for, or quite frankly, they might actually have some real safety or security concerns given their child or teenager's prior behavior. So, this isn't something new necessarily that's happened, but what is new, I found out, is that hospitals are having a real hard time getting any help for these kids. So in the past, they used to call Child Protective Services if a parent or a guardian didn't come to pick up their child. And so, the state might get involved and look for a resolution with the family, or they might eventually actually take a child into custody, depending on the circumstance. But in this story, we found out that Washington is actually no longer considering these cases child abandonment cases. So what happens is the ERs end up boarding these kids again for days or weeks at a time. When I spoke with folks at the state agency that oversees Child Protective Services, one of the questions I asked them was, is this because of a lack of resources? You're not able to bring children into care or into foster care or find, other alternative living arrangements? And they said that, yes, it's certainly about resource constraints, but it's also part of a general policy shift that they're making. So I think this story illustrates really the pressures that state agencies are certainly feeling, but also the ways that this type of response from the state is adding pressure and responsibility to a very overstretched healthcare system. There are two final things that I'll say about these stories. After they published, we received an overwhelming response. We got a lot of feedback from families, advocacy groups, lawmakers, and I think, as I said, that response will fuel more stories for us. The second thing I just wanted to mention briefly is that these stories really would not have been possible without the courageous participation of psychiatrists, nurses, social workers, and hospital administrators who decided to speak out about this problem, which in some ways, it shows the strain of the hospitals, but it also shows that ERs really are not equipped. And so, this was a choice that individual folks made to come out and say exactly what their day-to-day was like in the ER, paint a really clear picture of it. And I don't think these stories would have been possible without that. And, we included the voices of a lot of different professionals, including some of your UW colleagues. So I think we were able to get these stories together in large part because of them. Okay, I'm ready for the next slide. I want to close and just talk a little bit about how to get in touch with us and how we can start building relationships. So I know I've already mentioned this, but I like to stay in touch with researchers and know what's going on in their research world. You are my best source of information, so please do reach out. I'm always happy to chat on background if you just want to let me know what you're working on or what questions you're interested in. You can reach out to us over email, always happy to chat on the phone. I know with COVID, meeting in person hasn't been possible for a long time, but we are starting to do some in-person recording. If you feel like you want to meet outside or at your office, we can talk about that. If you do have a story now or in the future that you think you want to pitch to us, I jotted down a few things to keep in mind. You can see those on the slide. We are newspaper reporters, so we're writing for a general audience. So again, thinking about stories that have a tangible impact on our greater Seattle community. If you have a translational research project in the works or even basic science that you think will advance our understanding of a particular mental health condition, we're interested in that, just let us know. We can't promise that all of the tips we get will turn into stories. In fact, many of them don't, but knowing about what you're working on might help us think about a future trend story, or, we might use that information in some way to think about our coverage. I also just wanted to let you know that we're always happy to chat on background first, so you don't have to feel like by giving us a call, suddenly your name is in the newspaper. So you can reach out to us and just tell us what you're working on in a more casual way. I do find that oftentimes researchers decide that they do want to talk with us on the record and share their work. So just know that there are different paths in reaching out. So with that, I think we're ready to take any questions.
Okay, thank you, Diana, and thank you, Hannah, for walking us through the objective vision of the series, the origin of the project as well, example stories, examples of or experiences with doing the reporting, Hannah, that you described. this is very informative, and we do have several comments and questions that have come in. I want to encourage participants to write, type in any comments or questions into the chat, and we can go through those now. One question that came in is related to if people may face obstacles talking with you from media relation departments at institutional homes. Are there issues or conflicts that come up? Do you not see that? What happens?
I think anytime we approach somebody about a story, I think the question is always, what's our angle, what are we hoping to accomplish, and our job is to explain that in a proper way that is all-encompassing and helps the source or the PIO understand what we're trying to get at. I think it varies a lot by story. I think on this team, we've had really good relationships with the people that we've worked with for the most part. I know that the hospitals that Hannah worked with for the pediatric boarding story were very super helpful compared to other experiences that not this team, but other times we've had in reporting something out. Like maybe there's always a tension when there's a crisis situation or something that we're investigating as journalists. There's always a little bit of tension between a spokesperson or public representative who's trying to make their institution come out okay in the story, and we're trying to get information, and that's just always kind of a balancing act and back and forth. But I think we found with this topic that a lot of the institutions we work with have been very super helpful and straightforward, and know that this information will help the public if it gets out there. And so they've been really willing to work with us for the most part.
Thank you.
I would just add that, personally, I try to have a good relationship with folks who work in media relations departments, especially at research institutions, because oftentimes they're able to have their ear to the ground in a way that I can't always when it comes to just knowing what new research is coming out. So it doesn't always have, certainly sometimes it can feel adversarial between media and public relations departments, but that's certainly not the way that I try to approach my work. We want to write good and truthful stories. We don't write stories off of press releases, really. So again, it kind of goes back to that relationship building. If someone in a media relations department has an interesting story they think we want to be interested in, my next stop is to talk immediately with the researcher. So I want to hear it right from the person who's working on the work. I want to, as I said, do some double checks with outside researchers. We're really thorough to try to get a sense of what the story is, and ultimately we have editorial control. So we'll make decisions about balancing, as I said, especially stories like the one about the vaccine prediction, the promises and the pitfalls. So yeah, we don't go in with adversarial attitudes. we try to, work with folks.
Thank you, Hannah, for not only your follow-up comments on the first question, but answering another question that had come in. 2 in 1. Very good. All right. Another question that had come in from a participant about beyond emerging research, what do you see as, you gave a vision and you talked about the 5 domains, but if you could maybe re-highlight or comment on this, I guess beyond emerging research, what's most useful for people to approach you with a tip, so to speak? And this person gives examples as training, workforce development, equity challenges.
I think sometimes there's a bit of a magic ingredient that makes a news story and makes it interesting to people. And it's a little bit hard to explain when you're not in the business, but I think anything that has an impact on a large number of people, especially we are a local newspaper, so our stories really do need to harken back to that community focus. So yeah, an impact on a large number of people, just something really super fascinating can also make an interesting story. And then we are always wanting to interrogate systems and policies and practices and look for parts of a system that can be changed so that it improves people's lives and betters things for our readers. So anytime that if you all see, this part of the mental health system has a problem, and if you think it might not be something that's super obvious, but that might be of interest to us, we'd love to hear about that too.
I would just add that we also, are interested in accountability stories. That's kind of a jargon that we use in journalism, but again, that just means stories that hold the powerful to account. So whether that's a story about government or a story about a research institution or a story about a hospital, we, certainly want to know if there's something, going wrong that we should be thinking about reporting on. We also are looking for stories that focus on equity and access to mental health care. Certainly, we haven't really had a chance to dig into this, but I'm personally interested in the breakdown between Medicaid, folks who have Medicaid and folks who have private insurance, and the quality and access to care and how those things differ across different hospitals and depending on, what kind of level of care you need. That's a story we haven't even been able to dig into yet, and it's a big one, but things that kind of get at those issues, especially, where lower income folks or communities of color or, other communities just aren't getting the level of care that they need. So anyway, those are just some other things to think about.
Thank you. A couple of other questions had come in. One, Hannah, you had mentioned you'll investigate a story, talk to many people, write it up, and so on, and that may go on for a while. And then afterwards, you hear from more people, and it's maybe even a bigger story than you thought initially. I don't know. Does that usually lead to like a next story? Do you learn things that you wish you would have known initially? Can you tell us about that a little bit?
I think both. Certainly I learned things that I wish I would have known initially. But, for example, the house and the hospital story I spent, probably 6 months on the main story there. And I did feel like, when I was starting to write it, I almost felt like I just knew what to say because of course, I was looking back at my notes and transcripts, but the story just felt so clear to me because I had spent that amount of time reporting. However, after that story published, I did get a lot of feedback, especially from folks who work in inpatient facilities who had more to share about that side of things. So, did a story about what's happening in ERs, but that's only one piece of this continuum of care that has many sort of broken intersections. And so I think there will be a lot more stories, based on that feedback that kind of certainly get at inpatient, and hopefully we can eventually tackle the big sort of area of outpatient care, which is going to be a big challenge. But yes, in any case, we're listening to feedback. It helps inform our future coverage, and it also causes us to have reflection, I think, on our previous stories, what we could have done better, what we can do in the future.
And thank you for your comments, Hannah. And another question came in about connecting a new research development with sort of what's called lived experience stories, or stories from people who have maybe had experiences with the condition being studied. What's the best way to make those connections in an article? The person asks. Going from research to patient experience.
I think the ECT article is a great example of that. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Hannah, but I think we heard about that one mostly from patients initially who had, or providers who had struggled to get their patients care. So it was the kind of human story that was very compelling, and then that helped us then dig into the data and the research behind it. But we have gone the other way too, where we come across, especially if it's a new study that's really timely and connected to a really interesting topic in the news, that might jump out, and then we look for, we might look to a health provider or somebody to make connections for us to interview people that they've worked with, or people in the community that might have a connection to that issue. I hope that answered the question. Or go for it, Hannah.
Yeah, I think the only thing that I'd add is that, sometimes researchers come to us with some research that they know will publish in a couple of months. There's a study that came out from, I think, one of your colleagues, Rebecca Hendrickson, must have been December, but I knew about the research many months before, and the research essentially was on mental health and healthcare workers and how COVID was training them. And the results were, again, some pretty dire ones. And so I took that research knowing, this is interesting just from a research standpoint, but what can I find if I go and talk to therapists who work with healthcare workers? And what can I find when I actually talk with a bunch of healthcare workers? And so just knowing about that research early allowed me independently to go out and find people. And that's the way that we do our journalism. Sometimes researchers have people involved in the research who are willing to talk with us, but more often than not, we're going out independently to find other folks who can give us some more perspective on the findings and how they hold up in real life. I mean, yeah, so hopefully that's helpful.
Thank you for both commenting on that. Someone wrote in with a question. I want to broaden it out a little bit. This person writes in and asks about, is there perhaps a risk that you need to consider a way to publishing patient perspective stories? And there's an example about considering something called behavioral contagion. I wasn't aware of this, but something called a recent tick phenomenon that went through TikTok. But I guess more broadly, what does one consider when weighing the pros and cons of publishing what we might think clinically of as private medical information? Yeah, can you comment on that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the cases that we come across the most with this is suicide and suicide contagion. And we try to be very, very careful and thoughtful about how we write about it. And we've, as a team, have had meetings with experts on this to kind of share best practices. And we just try to keep those in mind. Some of it that boils down to pretty specific points, like not referencing certain details or that kind of thing. So that's the time when we come across it the most, I think, is with suicide. We haven't had a whole ton of experience with other behaviors, but I think the tick example is fascinating. We, as a team, we try as much as we can to just be super thoughtful about how we do describe pretty much anything related to mental health. So it's all very considered, and sometimes we will call an expert or somebody just to run a description by them and see what they think. They might not be a source in the story, but just somebody we know and can give us some advice. Yeah, it's definitely something on our mind for sure. And we also try to make sure that we really talk through with our sources the implications of being in a story, what that means, where the story is going to be shared. We try to make sure we have really clear expectations and full consent, so they know kind of what they're getting into.
Thank you for your response, Diana. We've got just a couple, maybe a minute or two. And so this is, I think, an example where there's more questions than we'll have time for. I want to mention that to the participants. Thank you, though, for writing in with comments and questions. Hannah, there were a couple of questions specifically about the emergency room story series. One was related to, did you come across this? Maybe this about maybe parents, family members also experiencing mental illness related to children being brought to the emergency department and not picked up afterwards. That was a question that came up about maybe family experience with illness. And the other question was related, or comment rather, was related to difficulty with sort of handoffs in care from maybe emergency care to inpatient care to outpatient care, and not having always open or clear communication about that, if that was something you learned about it in your investigating as well.
Yeah, I'll start by saying that if you have other questions for us, you can find us on on email. So please don't hesitate to reach out. We'll be happy to answer your questions. In terms of parents and family members with a history of mental illness, those who may have not picked their children up at the ERs, I did not get deep enough into that story to be able to answer that question. I apologize. I will say that I did hear from many parents after that story came out saying, I am one of the parents who could not pick their child up. And then, they sort of told me their reasons. And as I said before, very fraught, really difficult circumstances. And every one of them was very individual. I don't know more though about their history of mental illness. In terms of, yes, the trouble in the handoffs and the continuum of care, I think one of the stories, the first story talked quite a bit about what it's like for an ER to try to get in touch with an inpatient unit. I found it really fascinating and maybe some would describe it as frustrating, the ones who actually have to do this work, but it involves, a social worker or another staff member picking up the phone and calling each of the inpatient units, faxing them, just trying to get in touch and say, hey, do you have a bed? When is it available? And then faxing over information. And it feels very old school in many ways, but that's just how it's done. And then you kind of have to wait for a call back. And then it just feels very, difficult and frustrating for a lot of these folks. And so it's not really systematized in a way that seems to make a lot of sense for the people who are doing this work. And I think that just adds to the frustration, especially when they find out that there's not a bed available. So yeah, that's just one small piece of this continuum of care, that handoff. That can feel frustrating. There are many, many others that we don't have time to get into, but again, email us.
Well, great. We're just at the end. I can close things out for today. Diana or Hannah, if you have any, Hannah, you just invited and encouraged emails for questions or comments. Any final comments, Diana or Hannah?
No, I dropped our email addresses in the chat a little while back, but you can email us directly, or mentalhealth@seattletimes.com goes to the whole team. And we'd love to hear from you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for joining today's Grand Rounds, and we'll end Grand Rounds for today right there. Bye.